Perhaps you feel complacent, apathetic, or at least see complacency and apathy as problems in life. Today, in today's video, what I wanted to do is discuss ways of overcoming that by seeing some of its roots. And we'll look to early Buddhism to determine one of these roots. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. Today I want to discuss complacency and apathy. I think we know that complacency can lead to a sense of being stuck in a rut in our own lives, of not moving forward, of getting too dug in to where we are, to the point that we're not really getting all we can out of life. And in the broader scheme of things, complacency can be detrimental to a society. There was a recent Pew study, I think, that talked about, for example, the level of voter participation in elections in the United States over the last 40 years, I think it is, that oscillates somewhere between 50 and 60% of the adult voting population. And that's the sort of thing that is a problem for society. Because what it means if not all of us participate, if only a small number of us participate, is that elections, and I should say this number is for presidential elections, the numbers are much worse in off years when there isn't a president on the ballot. But what this results in is that the politicians who are supposed to run the country, after all, or run our states or cities, towns, are being elected by a very, very small sliver of the population, the most motivated. Oftentimes people who are extremist in one way or another. It's by being extreme that oftentimes people become motivated. And as a result, we tend to get a government that is more extreme in various respects than we might like, because many of us are just simply too apathetic to play a role in local government, even in voting. And this is only one of the most apparent problems with apathy in our lives. There are many others. As I say, apathy, complacency in our own lives can stop us from really moving forward, can stop us from achieving all that we might. So what are we supposed to do with this? Well, if we're not too apathetic even to start, then I would suggest that get up off the couch, as it were, and consider some of the roots of this potential roots of this apathy. And the Buddha in the early text discusses one such root. Now, there are going to be many. I don't think we should assume this is the only one. Of course it isn't. But it's an important one. And it's one that I think we often overlook. So what does the Buddha have to say? Well, it begins by the fact that we are embodied creatures. We live with a body, we live with senses, we interpret the world, and the world impacts us through our senses. We see things, we hear things, taste and smell and touch and so on. And what happens is that we come to experience the world through these senses, and that some parts of the world we find pleasurable, we find pleasant. And when we find parts of the world pleasurable and pleasant, that gives us impetus, it gives us energy to try to achieve those things. It gives us energy to try to maintain them, to hold on to them, to stop them from going, to leaving us. Or also, when we think about them potentially in the future, we are motivated to go get them. We're motivated to change things in order to get them. On the other hand, we'll have other experiences that we find unpleasant, that we find painful. And these also give us an impetus, an energy to do things, an energy to change our lives perhaps, in order to escape these painful things. Or if we foresee a painful occurrence in the future, we may act to forestall that from happening. If we really do see a bad outcome in some vote, we may, in fact, participate in the election. We may participate in local government or national government because we see some problem coming up in the future. that can be a way out. But I would submit that for most of our lives, most of the time, we're not in either of those situations. What we're is in a state of neither pleasurable nor painful, a state of what we might call neutral feelings, where we don't feel a pleasant thing and therefore we're not motivated to go get it, and we also don't feel pain and so we're not motivated to stop it. Instead, we're sort of sunk in a kind of a mud of neutral. Now, feelings, the Pali word is Vedana, feelings are part of one of the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates is what goes up into making the human person in an early Buddhist analysis. The aggregate of feeling is one of the 4 mental aggregates. Then there's the aggregate of the body is the 5th. And so this is the Buddha considers a critical part of who we are. That is, our ability to determine pleasurable from painful is sort of an integral and important part of our minds. It's really a part of our minds that is part of what makes the human condition what it is. And what the early Buddhist scholar Analayo has pointed out is that these neutral feelings really encompass most of what we experience. He says that neutral feeling easily seems to be the most stable of the 3 feelings. How is that? Well, it's the most stable because it takes up the most of our experience. It seems that almost all of what we experience is this kind of neutral, this kind of gray. We rarely will be encountering something that we really find pleasurable or pleasant. And again, rarely will we be encountering things that we really find unpleasant or painful. Most of what we experience in our lives is neutral. And so neutral comes to seem like the kind of ground out of which, we might say, the pleasurable and the painful arise. It's almost like this sort of ground of being, this kind of gray kind of soup that is our ordinary life. Since these neutral feelings seem so normal, so usual, so stable and permanent, we often overlook them when it comes to being mindful about our experience, either within our daily life or even mindful meditation while we're seated in formal meditation. We forget to notice neutral feelings because they seem so gray, they seem so uninteresting and unimportant. And that is exactly the problem. It's said, indeed, in the early texts that neutral feelings stimulate ignorance. They're part of the ground of ignorance. That is to say, our ordinary tendency towards ignorance underlies these feelings. And this awareness that neutral feelings are linked to ignorance is, I think, an extremely profound thing that the Buddha notices. And it's one that we shouldn't overlook either. Because it's ignorance that's the problem for us, after all. Pleasant feelings stimulate us to cling to things. I think we all know that. It's something that's quite active in our lives, that when we find something pleasant or pleasurable, we cling to it. We don't want it to go away. And that's a problem. Also, painful feelings, well, they stimulate aversion. When we find something painful, we want to get away from it. We want to push it out of our lives. We want to push it out of our minds. We don't want to think about it. And that also is a problem. But in both of these cases, there's an activity here that may make us more immediately aware of what's going on. It may provoke us with energy. In the case of the neutral feelings, there isn't such an energy. Life just simply seems gray. We don't notice that there's anything to be done. We become complacent. We become apathetic. We sort of relax into what we might call an uneasy state of sort of being in between happy and unhappy, into something that may seem to us almost like equanimity, but it's a false equanimity. It is, in fact, apathy instead of equanimity. I did an earlier video on whether or not you can be too equanimous, and part of that issue in that video was really deciding between a kind of apathetic response and true equanimity, which is a kind of a state of mind that is alive to possibilities. That's not sort of mired in complacency and sort of a blah kind of gray state of mind. And I think we've all been in that kind of gray state of mind where life just sort of seems okay. That's how we live a lot of our lives. And I can see that in my own life too a lot of the time. Life seems okay. So there doesn't seem to be anything obvious to be done, so we sit back in this kind of complacency. So what is it that we should do then? Well, what the Buddha says actually is, when you experience a neutral feeling, if you truly understand that feeling's origin, ending, gratification, danger, and escape, the underlying tendency to ignorance does not underlie that. That is, if we can abandon apathy for a time and put some real mindful effort into trying to see these states for what they are, that we can begin to wear away at the ignorance that underlies them. In particular, we might ask ourselves how it is that these neutral states arise. Where do they come from? When do they end, and how do they end? That's something that we can see in our own experience. I can't tell you because you'll have to really see it in your own experience. We can also contemplate the gratification of such states. That is, what is it that's pleasurable about them? Why don't we push them away? Why aren't we aversive to them? Because we aren't aversive to them, it means that there's something in them that doesn't make us aversive, that makes us accepting of them for what they are. We may not cling to them precisely, but at least we're accepting of them. Well, what makes them that way? And I don't mean necessarily in an intellectual fashion, although that may be part of what we might want to do, but in an experiential fashion. In other words, contemplating them while we're sitting with them. And also, what are their dangers? What are the dangers of these kinds of neutral feelings? I've already discussed some of the dangers that come from apathy. Perhaps you can think of others in your own life, specific ones even. Perhaps we can also think of some of the dangers involved in ignorance, which is the elephant in the room, the thing that's really behind the curtain here, that's pulling the strings, if you like. What are some of the difficulties? What are some of the dangers that come out of the ignorance that is produced in these states, in these neutral states? Because I don't think neutral states, neutral feelings are our friend. We accept them in a friendly way because we don't seem to worry about them. But they aren't our friend. They can be insidious, like a sort of a slow-acting quicksand, if you like. That's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? But my point is, maybe perhaps the better example would be boiling a frog. It's said, there's an expression that, how do you boil a frog? Well, you turn the heat up very, very, very slowly, and so the frog never jumps out of the pot because it never really gets scalded, and instead it gets boiled because it never jumps out. Now, in fact, I think this is actually supposed to be false. The frog will eventually jump out, but run with me anyway. The point is that if we notice things in our lives that are in that kind of in-between state, they can, over time, sort of boil us where we are without our really even noticing it. So what I would suggest in your own practice is to take a look at these states. That is to say, what is it that we can do to counteract these problems? Well, what we can do is to put effort into it, right effort into it. We can put right mindfulness into it. We can become aware of these states directly for what they are, for how they work in our lives. And through doing that, perhaps we can indeed begin to wear away at this ignorance underlying them and make them, in their own way, less of a burden. Now, I did an earlier video on overcoming laziness and apathy, which is a very similar issue, and I discussed a little bit of this as well in there, and I'll put a link to that up on the screen if you want to hear more. Thanks so much to all of you. If you're getting things out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look at my Patreon page and joining us. I have a link to the Patreon page down below. Thanks so much to all of my Patreon patrons. Thanks to you, and we'll catch you on the next video. Meanwhile, be well.